Welcome to Sleepy History for Sleep. Tonight we'll drift slowly into the world of colonial America in the 1700s and discover the quiet stories of everyday life in a time long ago, exploring the small moments and slow rhythms of life in the past. Let us begin with a quiet journey, back in time to the 17th century, the early 1600s, when the first waves of Europeans began arriving on the shores of North America. It was a time when the Atlantic Ocean was a barrier of both fear and hope. Ships crossed slowly, wooden vessels creaking, sails filled with uncertain winds. Many passengers were cramped together, carrying little more than their clothing, a few tools, and their hopes for a better life. They came from England, Holland, Spain, France, and other corners of Europe, seeking land, freedom, or sometimes just survival. When they arrived, they stepped onto a land that had been lived in for thousands of years by Native American nations. This was not empty wilderness, but a place full of villages, trails, farmlands, hunting grounds, and spiritual traditions. The arrival of colonists brought not only new tools and customs, but also tension, misunderstanding, and at times friendship or terrible conflict. In 1607, the English established Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America. At first, it was little more than a wooden fort built along a marshy riverbank. The men who settled there were not prepared for the challenges. Many were gentlemen unused to farming or manual labor. They imagined they would find gold or silver, but instead they found disease-carrying mosquitoes, brackish water, and long, hungry months. The starving time in the winter of 1609 to 1610 became infamous. Food supplies ran dangerously low. Accounts describe how desperate settlers ate rats, snakes, and even boiled shoe leather. Out of nearly 500 colonists, only about 60 survived that winter. It was a grim reality, not the dream of riches that many had imagined, but slowly, the colony endured. Help from local Powhatan tribes was essential. Native people traded corn and taught the settlers how to grow crops suited for the land. Yet relations were uneasy and often violent, as two different worlds collided. As the years passed, more settlements appeared, from New England to the Carolinas. Each region had its own rhythm of life, shaped by the land and the people who lived there. A colonial day usually began with the rising sun. Houses were small, built of wood or sometimes stone, with a single fireplace that served as both stove and heater. Families lived together in close quarters. Beds were often stuffed with straw. Windows were small, covered with oiled paper instead of glass in the poorer homes. Meals were plain. Bread, porridge, and stews were common. Meat was a luxury, unless you lived on a farm with animals. In New England, fish was plentiful. In Virginia and Maryland, corn, beans, and squash crops learned from native traditions became staples. Children worked from a very young age. A boy might learn to chop wood, herd animals, or plow fields. A girl might learn to spin wool, churn butter, or tend the garden. Education was not guaranteed. In Puritan New England, however, reading the Bible was seen as essential, so schools and lessons were more common. In 1620, a group of English separatists, known today as the Pilgrims, crossed the ocean on the small ship Mayflower. They landed at what would become Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts. Unlike the men at Jamestown, the Pilgrims traveled with families, including women and children. They sought religious freedom and the chance to live by their beliefs. Their first winter was devastating. Nearly half of them died from cold, disease, and hunger. Yet with the help of native people such as Tisquantum, better known as Squanto, who taught them how to plant corn with fish as fertilizer, the colony survived. By the fall of 1621, they held a harvest feast, later remembered as the first Thanksgiving. Though the event was real, it was not the grand holiday we imagine today, but rather a simple gathering of survival and gratitude. Through the 1600s, waves of Puritans arrived in New England. They believed in strict religious order, long sermons, and communities where everyone was expected to work hard. Towns grew around a central meeting house. On Sundays, bells rang, and people walked, sometimes for miles to attend hours-long services. Punishments for disobedience could be severe. Stocks and pillories were placed in public squares. A person who spoke against the church or neglected duties might be whipped, fined or shamed before their neighbours. Life was demanding, but there was also community. Quilting bees, barn raisings, and shared harvest work bound people together. Nights were long and quiet, lit by candles and firelight, with families gathered around hearths telling stories or reading scripture. Farther south in Virginia and Maryland, another way of life developed in the 17th century. Here the land was fertile, and tobacco became the great cash crop. Tobacco was difficult to grow, but it was in high demand in Europe. Colonists cleared large fields, built drying barns, and shipped barrels of the plant across the Atlantic. At first, labour came from indentured servants, poor Europeans who signed contracts to work for several years in exchange for passage to America. But as time went on, enslaved Africans were brought by force to work the fields. By the late 1600s, slavery had become a harsh and permanent institution in the southern colonies. Plantation life was very different from that of small New England farms. Wealthy planters lived in larger houses, often 2 stories tall, with porches and orchards. But most colonists lived modestly, working long hours in the sun. For the enslaved, life was filled with hardship, back-breaking labour, and little freedom. Their stories, though often silenced in records, were part of the true fabric of colonial life. By the end of the 1600s, colonial America was no longer just a fragile experiment. Settlements stretched along the eastern coast. Towns had markets, meeting houses, and churches. Ships carried goods across the Atlantic. Yet life remained uncertain. Disease, harsh winters, poor harvests, and conflicts with native tribes or rival European powers made survival fragile. The 17th century was a century of beginnings, a century when small wooden forts became towns. When the dream of new life was tested by hunger, cold, and conflict, families rose at dawn, worked until dusk, and hoped that tomorrow would bring enough food, safety, and peace. And so, as we pause here, we leave the story at the threshold of the 18th century. A new century was coming, one of growth, trade, and eventually the stirrings of revolution. But for now, the colonies remained places of labour, faith, and daily struggle. As the 17th century ended, and the 18th century began, colonial America had grown. The fragile wooden forts and scattered huts of the early 1600s were now replaced by towns, farms, and plantations. By the early 1700s, there were 13 colonies stretching along the Atlantic coast. Each colony had its own character, shaped by geography, people, and belief. Yet together, they formed a society where daily life was a mix of routine, hardship, and small comforts. Life in the towns was different from life in the countryside. A typical colonial town had a cluster of wooden houses, usually built close together, with narrow dirt streets between them. At the centre stood the meeting house or church, a symbol of community. Shops sold cloth, tools, spices, and household goods. The blacksmith's forge rang with the sound of hammer on iron. The smell of fresh bread came from the baker's oven. Children might carry water from a well, or chase one another down the dusty lanes. In the evenings, towns grew quiet. Candles flickered in windows. Families gathered indoors, reading by dim light or spinning wool into yarn while telling stories of their ancestors. Most colonists, however, lived outside of towns. They worked on farms. Daily life began at sunrise. Roosters crowed. Farmers led oxen into the fields. Women milked cows, fed chickens, and baked bread in outdoor ovens. Crops varied depending on the region. Bromstalls, in New England, rocky soil made farming difficult. Their families grew small gardens and relied on fishing, lumber, and trade. In the middle colonies like Pennsylvania and New York, wheat and grain fields stretched across the land, giving the region the nickname the breadbasket colonies. In the southern colonies, tobacco, rice, and later cotton grew in wide plantations, tended by the forced labor of enslaved Africans. The work was endless: plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, storing. Winter was a time of mending tools, preserving food, and gathering around fires. Life moved with the seasons, slow and steady, year after year. Colonial homes were simple but practical. In the early 1700s, most families lived in 1 or 2 room houses made of wood, with chimneys of brick or stone. Wealthier families might have larger homes with several fireplaces, glass windows and painted walls. Furniture was sturdy and plain, a wooden table, a few chairs, perhaps a chest for clothing. Beds were stuffed with straw or feathers. Floors were swept with brooms made of twigs. For cooking, women worked at open hearths, stirring large iron pots. They made stews, bread, pies and puddings. In many homes, meals were eaten from wooden trenchers or pewter plates. Knives were common, but forks were still rare in the early 1700s. Religion remained at the center of many colonial lives. In Puritan New England, strict rules guided behavior. Long sermons filled Sundays, and the Sabbath was treated with seriousness. In the middle colonies, diversity was greater. Quakers in Pennsylvania, Catholics in Maryland, and other groups created a patchwork of beliefs. The South, too, had churches, though with more spread-out congregations. Life was less centered on the meeting house. At times, religion brought fear as well as comfort. One of the most remembered episodes was the Salem witch trials of 1692 in Massachusetts. Though technically the very end of the 17th century, its echoes continued into the 1700s. Accusations of witchcraft, fueled by fear and superstition, led to trials and executions. The event revealed how fragile communities could be when fear took hold. In the 18th century, literacy slowly spread. In New England, many children learned to read so they could study the Bible. Small schools appeared, with lessons on hornbooks, wooden paddles with paper sheets covered by thin cow horn. Books were few. The Bible, prayer books and almanacs were the most common. An almanac contained weather predictions, farming tips and proverbs, making it useful for everyday life. For wealthier boys, especially in towns, education could include Latin, mathematics and writing. Girls were less likely to attend formal school, but many learned at home, studying sewing, reading and household management. By the early 1700s, the colonies were deeply tied into global trade. Ships carried furs, lumber and tobacco to Europe, returning with cloth, tools and luxuries. The triangular trade connected North America, Africa and Europe. From Africa came enslaved men, women and children, sold into bondage in the colonies. From the Caribbean came sugar and molasses. Markets and fairs brought colonists together. People exchanged goods, bartered and shared news. Coins were scarce, so barter was common. Corn for cloth, labor for tools. By the middle of the 18th century, the colonies had grown stronger, larger and more connected. Villages had become towns, and towns had grown into bustling centers of trade. Ships carried goods across the Atlantic. Roads and paths stretched into the countryside, and life felt both familiar and ever-changing. Towns in the mid-1700s were full of sound and movement. Cobblestone streets echoed with the clip-clop of horses' hooves. Carriages rolled past wooden shops painted in modest colours. Signs swung outside taverns, blacksmiths and apothecaries. A tavern was not only a place for drink, but also a centre for news and discussion. Merchants shared the latest word from London. Farmers brought produce to sell. Travellers stopped to rest and exchange stories. Children ran errands, carrying baskets of bread, candles or firewood. Apprentices hurried to workshops, sweeping floors, fetching water, and slowly learning their crafts. At night, towns were quiet. Street lamps were few. The darkness was deep, broken only by the glow of lanterns carried by those who dared to walk after dusk. For those living outside towns, farming remained the heart of life. The rhythm of the seasons ruled everything. Spring meant planting. Men ploughed with wooden ploughs, often pulled by oxen or horses. Women sowed seeds for gardens. Children gathered kindling and carried water. Summer was long and busy, with fields of wheat, corn, tobacco needing constant care. Weeds were pulled, fences mended, animals tended. Autumn brought harvest. Families worked from dawn to dusk, gathering crops, storing grain, salting meat, and preparing for winter. Winter slowed the pace. Snow covered the land. Families mended clothing, repaired tools, and spun wool by the hearth. Nights were long, filled with quiet tasks and stories. Though labor was hard, there was comfort in repetition. Year after year, season after season, families followed the same patterns. By the mid-1700s, Colonial diets were simple but filling. Bread was the daily staple, baked in brick ovens or iron kettles. Cornmeal porridge, sometimes called hasty pudding, was common. Meat came from pigs, chickens and cattle, though it was often salted or smoked to last through the winter. Apples grew in orchards and were pressed into cider. In wealthier households, imported tea and coffee were served in delicate cups, a sign of status. By the 1700s, towns offered many trades. Printers produced newspapers and pamphlets. Silversmiths crafted fine utensils. Shoemakers made sturdy boots. Tailors cut and stitched clothing. Innkeepers hosted travelers. In port cities like Boston, New York and Charleston, docks were filled with ships. Sailors loaded barrels of tobacco, fish and furs, bound for markets in Europe. Ships returned with cloth, china, books and even luxuries like sugar and rum. Craftsmen often placed painted signs outside their shops. Since many people could not read, the signs used symbols: a boot for a cobbler, a key for a locksmith, a tankard for a tavern. Families in the 1700s were often large. 6, 8, or even 10 children were not unusual, though sadly, many did not survive to adulthood due to disease. Children were expected to work early. A boy might herd cattle at age 6, chop wood at age 8, and by 12 begin learning a trade. A girl helped with spinning, cooking, sewing, and caring for younger siblings. Play was simple: rolling hoops, playing with carved wooden dolls, or tossing balls made of rags. There was little separation between work and play. Even games often involved chores or skills that would be useful later in life. The mid-1700s also brought conflict. Between 1754 and 1763, the French and Indian War, part of a larger struggle between Britain and France, shook the colonies. For many colonists, this meant soldiers passing through towns, shortages of supplies, and uncertainty. Native tribes were drawn into the conflict, some siding with the French, others with the British. Though distant battles may have seemed far from ordinary farms, the war shaped lives. Taxes increased, trade was disrupted, and families feared raids in frontier areas. By this time, slavery was firmly established, especially in the South. Enslaved Africans worked on rice plantations in South Carolina, tobacco fields in Virginia, and cotton fields that began to grow in importance. Some lived in towns, working as blacksmiths, carpenters, or household servants. Their labor was essential to the colonial economy, yet their lives were controlled, their freedoms denied. Indentured servitude still existed, but it was declining as slavery became the dominant system of labor in the southern colonies. By the late 1700s, the colonies had grown used to governing themselves in small ways. Town meetings, assemblies, and local councils gave colonists a voice. Yet they remained under British rule, expected to follow laws made across the ocean. When new taxes and regulations arrived from London, frustration grew. Colonists debated in taverns, churches, and homes. For ordinary people, life went on much as before, but whispers of change began to stir. Still, for most men, women, and children, daily life was not about politics. It was about planting, cooking, mending, praying, and working. The great events of history were like distant thunder, while the close rhythm of everyday survival was steady and immediate. As the 1770s unfolded, the colonies stood at a turning point. The quiet routines of farming, trading, and family life continued, but now new voices rose in taverns and town squares. The idea of freedom, of independence from Britain, began to stir more strongly than ever before. Men sometimes left their farms to join militias, leaving wives, children, or elderly relatives to carry the burden of daily work. A woman might rise before dawn, milk cows, gather eggs, plough fields with the help of her children, and then cook meals for the family, all while wondering when her husband or son might return from the fighting. Some farms fell into disrepair during the war. Crops failed without enough hands to tend them. Weeds grew tall, fences sagged, and barns slowly decayed. Still, families endured, finding strength in persistence, one day at a time. In towns, the war was felt in different ways. Markets had fewer goods, as trade with Britain was disrupted. Imported tea became scarce. replaced with herbal substitutes. Cloth was harder to find, so people mended and patched clothing again and again. Newspapers, once filled with local announcements, now carried reports of battles and speeches about liberty. At the taverns, men debated the meaning of freedom late into the night, voices rising, candles burning low. Some supported independence, while others, called loyalists, remained faithful to Britain. This divided even families and neighbours, sometimes leading to bitter quarrels. As the war dragged on, shortages grew. Salt, sugar and molasses were hard to obtain. Families made do with what they had. Coffee was replaced with roasted acorns or chicory root. Sugar was stretched with honey or maple syrup. Farmers bartered more than ever, trading eggs for cloth, butter for tools. A patched coat or a pair of worn shoes was more valuable than gold in many homes. Meals were plain: bread, stews, and whatever vegetables or meat could be raised nearby. Families stretched food to last through long winters, eating carefully, sparingly, and with gratitude for every bite. Women took on new responsibilities during the revolutionary years. With so many men away, women managed farms, ran shops, and cared for households alone. Some followed the armies as camp followers, cooking, washing, and nursing the sick. A few even disguised themselves as men to fight in battles, though such stories were rare. Most women, however, lived quietly, working tirelessly to keep homes and communities alive. Their spinning wheels turned flax and wool into yarn. Their hands sewed uniforms, churned butter, and tended gardens. Without their steady labour, life would have unravelled. For enslaved Africans in the colonies, the revolution carried a cruel paradox. While white colonists spoke of liberty and independence, many enslaved people remained in chains. Some joined the British, who promised freedom to those who escaped their patriot masters. Others fought for the Continental Army, hoping that their service would bring liberty. For most, however, life remained harsh. Days were filled with toil in fields and kitchens, and freedom was still far away. Native American communities faced difficult choices during the Revolution. Some allied with the British, hoping to slow the westward expansion of colonists. Others sided with the Americans, believing promises of peace and land. For many, the war brought destruction, as villages were raided and lands seized, while colonists dreamed of independence. Native peoples struggled to protect what remained of their homelands. By the early 1780s, the war neared its end. The fighting had been long, bitter, and costly. When peace finally came with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the colonies were no longer colonies. They were the United States of America. For ordinary families, the end of the war did not mean an immediate transformation. Fields still needed ploughing, houses still needed mending, food still needed cooking. The great victory was real, but daily life was still made up of the small, repetitive tasks of survival. A mother still spun wool, a father still chopped wood, children still fetched water. Independence had been won, but the rhythm of life continued as it always had, steady, slow, familiar. Life in colonial America was not only about surviving and working, it was also about community. People came together for worship, for markets, for celebrations, and sometimes even for punishments. These rhythms gave their lives order, meaning, and sometimes a bit of joy. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, religion shaped nearly every part of daily existence. Puritans in New England followed strict rules. Church attendance was mandatory, and sermons could last for hours. Children were taught to memorize scripture before they could even write properly. In the middle colonies, where Quakers, Lutherans, Mennonites, and others lived, religion was more diverse. People tolerated more differences. But worship still structured the week. In the southern colonies, the Church of England held sway. Planters built grand brick churches, while poorer farmers might only attend service once every few weeks because of distance. For colonists, church wasn't just a religious event. It was the social hub. People dressed in their finest clothes, exchanged news, and met neighbours. For children, it could be boring, but for adults it was often the highlight of the week. Colonial people rarely had entertainment in the modern sense. Instead, they made their own. Runts, barn raisings, and quilting bees were community events where everyone pitched in, helping a family while also turning labour into festivity. Markets and fairs were occasions to trade goods, show off livestock and enjoy music or folk games. Storytelling and folk tales passed long winter evenings. Colonists told ghost stories, moral tales, and sometimes exaggerated adventures of faraway lands. Colonial America was not an equal society. Wealthy landowners in Virginia and South Carolina lived in large plantations, owned enslaved people, and wielded political power. In contrast, small farmers, blacksmiths, and carpenters lived more modestly, working hard just to stay afloat. Indentured servants often lived at the bottom of the social ladder, working for years before they could gain freedom and hope for their own land. This social order was visible in clothing, homes, and even church seating arrangements. The wealthy often sat at the front pews, the poor and enslaved at the back or in galleries above. Colonial justice could be severe. Stocks and pillories stood in village squares, where wrongdoers were displayed as public shame. Minor crimes like gossip, drunkenness, or skipping church might earn time in the stocks. More serious crimes could result in whipping or banishment. Enslaved people tragically faced the harshest punishments with little chance of mercy. For children, misbehavior often earned corporal punishment at home or in school. Discipline was seen as necessary to raise obedient citizens in a strict and sometimes unforgiving world. In the 1600s, the Puritans who settled in New England believed they were creating a city upon a hill, a godly society that would be a model for the world. Life was structured around strict religious observance, church attendance was expected, and sermons could last for hours. Even leisure was shaped by religion. Songs, festivals, and stories often carried moral lessons. But this intense religiosity also led to tensions. The infamous Salem witch trials of 1692 showed the dangers of fear, superstition, and strict conformity. Over 200 people were accused of witchcraft, and 20 were executed. For centuries afterward, the trials stood as a grim reminder of what could happen when fear overcame reason. Unlike New England, the Middle Colonies, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware were known for their diversity. Quakers, Mennonites, Lutherans, Catholics, Jews, and others lived side by side. William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania in 1681, welcomed people of all faiths, creating one of the most tolerant societies of the 17th century. This openness attracted thousands of settlers from Europe who had faced persecution elsewhere. In the southern colonies like Virginia and the Carolinas, the Church of England, Anglican, was the established church. Plantation owners often supported Anglican ministers, and local laws encouraged church attendance. Still, the distances between farms and plantations meant religion sometimes played a quieter role in daily life compared to New England. African enslaved people brought their own spiritual traditions, blending them over time with Christianity, creating powerful new expressions of faith. By the early 18th century, religion in the colonies began to shift. A wave of spiritual revival known as the Great Awakening swept through the colonies. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards in Massachusetts and George Whitefield, who traveled widely, urged colonists to seek a more personal, emotional connection to God. Crowds gathered outdoors to hear fiery sermons, sometimes weeping or fainting with conviction. The Great Awakening was more than a religious event. It broke down barriers between colonies, created new denominations, and encouraged the idea of questioning traditional authority. Some historians argue that it planted the seeds for the American Revolution by showing ordinary people that they could challenge established leaders and make their own choices in matters of conscience. For the average colonial family, religion touched almost every part of life. Families prayed together at meals, observed the Sabbath strictly, and taught children to read the Bible. Life was often seen through a moral lens. Hard work, honesty, and faith were not just virtues, they were considered necessary for survival in the New World. Colonial America was not a single economy but a collection of different ones, shaped by geography, climate, and resources. Life in New England was very different from life in Virginia, and a farmer in Pennsylvania faced different challenges than a merchant in Boston. Yet all these economies connected, slowly weaving the colonies together. For most colonists, farming was the central task of daily life. In an age before industry, food came directly from the land. New England farmers worked small plots of rocky soil. Harsh winters and shorter growing seasons made large-scale farming difficult. Families grew wheat, rye, corn, and vegetables mainly for their own use, with little left over to sell. Livestock, cows, pigs, and sheep also played an important role. The middle colonies, with their fertile soil, became known as the breadbasket of America. Wheat, oats, and barley were grown in abundance, and mills ground grain into flour for trade. Turned farming into a massive enterprise. Warm weather and long growing seasons allowed for large plantations that produced tobacco, rice, indigo, and later cotton. These crops, called cash crops, were sold for profit, fueling trade across the Atlantic. While farmers tilled their fields, merchants and traders connected the colonies to the wider world. Colonial ports, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston grew into bustling centers of commerce. Ships carried grain, tobacco, furs, timber, and fish across the ocean to Europe. In return came cloth, tools, sugar, and luxury items. Colonial America was also part of the so-called triangular trade. Ships carried goods from New England to Africa, traded them for enslaved Africans, transported those captives across the Atlantic, the brutal Middle Passage, and then sold them in the Caribbean or the southern colonies. The ships then carried sugar, molasses, and rum back to New England. It was a system that made many merchants wealthy, while binding the colonies into a larger Atlantic world. The story of colonial labor is one of hardship and inequality. Many early colonists could not afford the voyage across the ocean. Instead, they signed contracts to work for a master for 7 years in exchange for passage to America. Indentured servants worked the fields, built houses, and performed countless tasks. At the end of their contract, they were free, though many had little land or money to start new lives. Over time, plantation owners in the South turned increasingly to enslaved African labor. Unlike indentured servants, enslaved people were bound for life, and their children were born into slavery. By the 1700s, slavery was deeply entrenched in the Southern economy, shaping the culture and wealth of the region. The human cost was immense. Broken families, stolen freedom, and lives lived under harsh control. Not all colonists lived near a city or port. Many families made their own goods. Women spun wool and flax into thread, wove cloth, and made soap and candles. Blacksmiths, carpenters and coopers, barrel makers, supplied essential tools and services. In many towns, a mill was the beating heart of the community, grinding grain or sawing timber. Life was not easy, but it was practical. Survival depended on resourcefulness, cooperation, and a constant rhythm of labor. By the 18th century, the colonial economy had matured. Farmers, artisans, merchants, and enslaved laborers each played their part in building a society that was slowly becoming more connected. Roads improved, trade routes expanded, and newspapers carried information about prices, ships, and markets. Though still tied to Britain, the colonies were learning to depend on themselves. As the calendar turned into the 18th century, life in colonial America grew both more settled and more complex. By now, several generations had been born in the colonies, and the New World was no longer new to them. Children grew up never having seen England, yet they were still considered subjects of the British Crown. Breakfast in the 1700s colonies was simple, yet hearty. Families might eat cornbread baked the night before, or porridge made from oats or Indian corn. Sometimes there was cheese, butter, or slices of cold meat left over from the previous evening. Colonial towns were small by modern standards. A place like Boston in 1720 had only about 12,000 people. Streets were narrow and often muddy. Wooden carts rattled past small shops selling cloth, tools, or imported goods from England. Apprentices worked under masters, learning trades like carpentry, shoemaking, or printing. In fact, a young man named Benjamin Franklin began his printing apprenticeship in Boston in the 1710s. He would later become one of the most famous figures in American history, but in those early years he was simply a boy covered in ink, learning how to set type by hand. Shops sold goods like sugar, molasses, and tea. Items brought across the Atlantic in wooden barrels stacked deep in the holds of ships. A colonial town always smelled of wood smoke, horses, and the sea. Religion shaped much of life in the colonies. Sunday was the day of rest and worship. In New England, strict Puritan traditions meant church attendance was expected. Families sat for hours listening to sermons, sometimes so long that children squirmed and fell asleep on the benches. Church bells did not only mark Sunday services, they also rang to signal important events, town meetings, public announcements, or even warnings of fire. In an age without clocks in every home, bells helped set the rhythm of the community. As the 18th century drew to a close, life in colonial America began to shift once again. The colonies had matured. Families who had once lived in crude wooden cabins now owned tidy farms, brick houses, or bustling shops along the main street of growing towns. Imagine the night before the American Revolution truly began. Somewhere in Massachusetts, a family sat by their hearth. The children had been tucked into bed, quilts pulled up against the crisp spring air. Outside, the frogs sang in the marshes, and a horse shifted in its stall. The father polished his boots, not knowing they might soon carry him to a militia muster. The mother laid out bread to rise for the morning, as she had done 1,000 times before. The revolution was near, but sleep still claimed tired bodies each night, just as it had for generations before. When we think of colonial America, we may picture powdered wigs, red brick courthouses, and dramatic historical events. But beneath all of that, life was slow, repetitive, and full of rhythms that carried families from one season to the next. The people who lived in the 17th and 18th centuries did not always see themselves as part of history. To them, it was simply life. Mending clothes, baking bread, tending gardens, cutting wood, hauling water, and rocking babies to sleep by the glow of a candle. Even as revolutions rumbled, daily life carried on with the same gentle persistence that had defined the colonies since their founding. And for us, hundreds of years later, it is this quiet constancy that makes their world so comforting to imagine as we drift toward rest. Colonial America was not just battles and declarations. It was the sound of water being poured into wooden basins at dawn, the creak of a loom weaving fabric for winter clothes, the smell of bread rising by the hearth, and the soft murmur of prayers whispered before bed. And so, as the night deepens, we leave colonial America where it belongs, in the gentle stillness of time past, a place of repetition and rest. A place where history is not loud but soft, where life moves slowly, and sleep always comes at the end of the day.